You're watching Let the Quran Speak. Now we discuss the Prophet Muhammad's marriages. The Prophet Muhammad has been criticized by modern commentators for his polygamous marriages. Was he a womanizer, a lustful and passionate man? What were his reasons for marrying so many women? Here with me is Brother Shabir Ali. Brother Shabir Ali, what are your thoughts on why the Prophet Muhammad married so many different women in his lifetime?
Yes, before I answer that directly, I want to pick up on something you said. I mean, you said that modern commentators criticize him. From my humble research into this question, it seems that it's not probably correct to say that modern commentators in general criticize him. It seems that the criticism usually comes in this respect from those who perhaps are familiar with the monastic tradition, and they may feel that even having one wife is too much for a righteous man, much less having multiple wives, as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did. So if they think that monasticism is the ideal and being celibate is the ideal, then seeing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with many wives, they think, well, this guy must be, he couldn't be religious.
And I guess in modern times also we think of monogamous marriages as the ideal, right? So anything that deviates from that raises questions.
At the same time, in our modern situation, we are well aware that there have been many different cultures. Many cultures still remain, and we interpret cultures in the light of circumstances that prevailed at various times. And when we look at the greatness of an individual, we measure the greatness of that individual based on the circumstances in which the individual lived.
So do you think that it's inappropriate to judge the Prophet Muhammad then on his marriages, given the context in which he lived, in which polygamous marriages were very common?
Well, before I answer that from my own perspective, I just wanted to clarify that modern commentators will tend to say that his marriages were largely for political and social reasons. To begin with, he lived in an environment in which it was quite normal to marry multiple women. And we know even from the sacred scriptures before him that many of the heroes and great prophets actually had multiple wives. We know, for example, that Abraham married Sarah, and at the same time he had Hajar, who was given to him by Sarah to be his concubine. And from her, Abraham had the son Ishmael. And later on, Abraham married Keturah. That does not detract from the greatness of Abraham, the fact that he had multiple wives, that he had a wife and a concubine. In the Islamic tradition, Hajar is actually viewed as a wife. We know that David had many wives. He's regarded in the Bible as a great king, and in the Islamic tradition as a great prophet. Sulaiman in the Islamic tradition is said to have had 700 wives and 300 concubines, according to the Book of Kings. And also in the Islamic tradition, it is known that he had multiple wives. But again, Muslims regard him as a great prophet. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, living within that history, it is not surprising that he would have had many wives, especially since he was a leader, and this is where a political and social aspect comes in. John Esposito, for example, in his book Islam, the Straight Path, and Karen Armstrong in her book on the life of the Prophet Muhammad have both stated plainly that Muhammad's marriages were largely for political and social reasons.
What are you mentioned political and social, what does that mean?
Well, let's think of the political first. Up until the Middle Ages, it was quite common for alliances between states to be cemented by an intermarriage. A prince of one kingdom marries the princess from another kingdom, and these kingdoms are brought together.
And it becomes enlarged and more powerful.
Exactly. And of course, this breaks down barriers and reduces the possibility of war between these kingdoms. And now when the Islamic faith started out as a blossoming tradition and with a new nascent group of people here, this was seen to be like a tribe competing with all of the other tribes in the area. Muslims become now the target of many others who wanted to decimate this population and wipe out this newfound faith. They saw it as a threat to their own continuing traditions inherited from their forefathers. Now, a clever thing to do was to build alliances with all of these various warring tribes. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did that. He entered into treaties and alliances to establish peace. But a greater level of that alliance which was put on paper was to build family relations And by the Prophet marrying into one of these tribes, he was actually cementing that relationship and creating goodwill, because now the people of that tribe can think that one of our daughters is married to the Prophet, this great new leader, and so we're attached to him and we're not at war with him anymore. So with this in mind, we can understand why the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, married Safiya, who was the daughter of Huyai, a people with whom the Muslims had been at war. Those people
were a Jewish tribe, right?
Yes, and they were defeated. Safiya was captured, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, freed her and then gave her the option to marry him, and according to the Islamic tradition, she decided to marry him. A similar thing was done with Juwayriya, and Juwayriya was from the Banu Mustalik tribe. They were at war with the Muslims, and when they were defeated, Juwayriya was captured. And when the Prophet, peace be upon him, married her, the Muslims decided to free all of her people who were captured in that war. And it is reported that Aisha said, I haven't seen a woman bringing more good to her people than Juwayriya did on the day that she got married to the Prophet, peace be upon him. So
those are political reasons. Now, let's
Yes.
move on to the social then. What were the social reasons for the Prophet Muhammad marrying some of the women that he married?
Yes. I can say more about political, because some other marriages fall under that category as well. But in terms of social, we can look, for example, at his marriage to Sauda. Sauda was an elderly woman. And when the Prophet's first wife, Khadija, died, there was no one really in the Prophet's household now to care for his young children. He had, according to some reports, 6 children from his first marriage. Some of them died in infancy, the boys, but 4 daughters remained, and some of them were quite young, such as Fatima. And it would have been useful to have a motherly figure to take care of Fatima and the others. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, married Sauda, who was about 55 years old, and that was a way of keeping his household together. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married some women who were widows after their husbands had fallen in battle defending this early Muslim community from outside attacks. So, for example, in the Battle of Badr, we have some widows emerging. Hafsa was the daughter of Umar. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her, and that was a way of taking care of the widows whose husbands had fallen in battle defending the nascent community. Now, of course, in modern times, we may say that women are quite free and they have everything at their disposal and their leisure. They're educated, they're working, they have careers and so on, and they may not need a husband. In those times, women actually felt unprotected, and they needed a male to take care of them and to provide for them. The Prophet, peace be upon him, by marrying Hafsa, was doing that and fulfilling that role. In a similar way, we have another woman who was known as al Masakin. She was known as the mother of the poor people, because she was so charitable to them. The Prophet, peace be upon him, married her after her husband had fallen in the Battle of Badr as well. Her name was actually Salama.
So are there any marriages that the Prophet had that don't fit the mold of trying to fulfill political and social purposes?
Well, his first marriage was known to be a normal sort of marriage, people meeting and getting married. He was about 25 years old, and he had been in the employ of a woman, Khadija by name, who was known for her own purity and her chastity in that environment. She was said in some traditions to be much older than he was, but he nevertheless got married to her, and he remained with her as his only wife until she finally died, and he was about 50 years old at the time. Which means that though she was much older than he was, nevertheless this was his only wife, and he was quite satisfied with her. It's only after her death that he began to marry more wives, and that was when he was in a position as a leader of the community, and his marriages would have served these noble social and political purposes that I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was his marriages like, or his family life? How did he treat the women in his life? he had many. So how did he treat them?
Well, traditions about this abound, and some try to praise his virility by saying, for example, that he went around to all of his wives in a single night and so on. So not all of the traditions are authentic, because they were written long after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, died, and people imagined him in various ways. But we have traditions which also show that there were sometimes disputes among the wives and jealousies among them. And this must have caused some consternation for the Prophet Muhammad himself. Some references is given in the Quran to the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was faced with a situation where he had to say to his wives, look, if you're not happy, then let me know, and I will try to arrange for you the best of provision, and we'll have, a goodly parting. And but
Did
if
he
you
treat his wives with respect and dignity?
Yes, yes, and this is the other side of it, is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was actually a poor person by choice, because he was the leader of the Muslims, and whatever he demanded of them, they would have provided. If a televangelist comes out today and says, look, I need this, then people will readily contribute. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had this, more than this, influence over his followers, but he didn't demand their goods of them. The continuing message in the Quran is that the Prophet is not going to ask them for any reward or any kind of material things. And so the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself remained quite poor, and so his wives, you're poor and then you have many wives, you can imagine the double strain and stress on the family. Nevertheless, the Prophet, peace be upon him, though being unable to provide many of the material things that we would want to provide for our wives, nevertheless treated them with great respect and honor. And he spoke to them kindly. He never beat any of his wives, according to the traditions. And this is interesting, because the traditions were collected later on by people who were interested to show that it is okay to beat wives, though to a limited extent. But at the same time, it is noted in these traditions that the Prophet never beat any of his wives. To me, this is an authentic recollection of the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you, Brother Shafiq.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, we answer questions we receive from you, our viewers.